Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, and I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Professor Jane McGonigal and Curtis Sittenfeld. FAN's a nonprofit organization that presents a high-quality speaker series offered free to the public on a wide variety of topics, including human development, mental health, education, and social justice, among others. We have over 175 videos of past events archived on our website and our YouTube channel, so please be sure to explore. And now introductions. Future forecaster and world-renowned designer of alternate reality games, Jane McGonigal is the Director of Games Research and Development at the Institute for the Future, a nonprofit research group in Palo Alto, California. She currently teaches the course How to Think Like a Futurist at Stanford and is the lead instructor for the Institute for the Future's course on the Coursera platform. Professor McGonigal is the New York Times bestselling author of Reality is Broken and Super Better, and her TED Talks on how games can make a better world and the game that can give you 10 extra years of life are among the all-time most popular TED Talks and have been more than 15 million views. Her innovative games and ideas have been recognized by the World Economic Forum, Harvard Business Review, Fast Company, MIT Technology Review, Business Week, O Magazine, and the New York Times, among many others. Curtis Sittenfeld is the New York Times bestselling author of the novels Prep, The Man of My Dreams, American Wife, Sisterland, Eligible, and Rodham, and the story collection You Think It, I'll Say It, which have been translated into 30 languages. Her short stories have appeared in The New Yorker, The Washington Post Magazine, Esquire, and the Best American Short Stories, of which she was the 2020 guest editor. Her nonfiction has appeared in The New York Times, The Atlantic, Time, and Vanity Fair, and on public radio's This American Life. And now let's welcome Jane McGonigal and Curtis Sittenfeld.
Thank you, Lonnie. Hi, Curtis.
Hi. Thank you. This is so fun. I'm so delighted to be doing this event with you tonight. I think I'll just, is there anything that you want to say, or should I just get started in asking you questions about your fascinating book?
Let's dive in. That was a great introduction from Lonnie.
All right. So one question, we were talking about this a little bit beforehand, but I'm sure that some people in the audience have read the book and some people haven't. And I always, when I'm talking to a writer about their book, I always like to say, to sort of start with, how would you describe this book in your own words?
What a good question. Yes. I would say it's an invitation to learn how to use our imagination in a new way, to kind of point our imagination toward the future and use the worlds that we can invent for ourselves and explore with others as a way to maybe change how we feel and act today. But I definitely think of it as it's like an interactive experience. You know, it's full of exercises and games and thought experiments. And so it's a very active reading experience, I hope, or interactive, to really train our imagination to do new things.
I definitely found it to be interactive and like really and truly. I'm not just saying this because I'm the person that I found it like really fascinating and really thought-provoking. And I think that also a sign of sort of an engrossing book is when you're talking about it with people in your normal life, like voluntarily. Okay, so I know you had a few experiences. Some are sort of collective pandemic experience that made you write this book at this moment. Can you describe that a little bit?
Yeah. So I started my career as a game designer, and I was interested in, could we design games that allow people who play video games to sort of use their gamer creativity and collective intelligence to help solve real world problems? And I was sort of making up different kinds of games that might allow them to do that, like analyzing scientific data for weird patterns, or, you know, what could gamers do? And one of the genres that I started playing with and essentially inventing was this idea of a massively multiplayer forecasting game, where I think of it kind of like a tabletop role-playing game, you know, kind of like Dungeons and Dragons, except instead of inviting a handful of people to your kitchen table, we would invite 10,000 or 20,000 people to this table on the internet and ask them to imagine how they might react and adapt and feel in different future scenarios. And the first really big, massively multiplayer future forecasting game that I created was a pandemic simulation. Futurists like to look 10 years out. So we played this game in 2008. It was set in the year 2019. And we were asking people really practical questions. So imagine there's a respiratory pandemic and the CDC has asked you to isolate or quarantine for 2 weeks. Under what conditions might you not follow their instructions? Break out of quarantine? Would you just be super strict? And we were asking people questions like that and just collecting their stories. And we're like, don't just tell us. I mean, write a story, a story that begins with, I'm leaving quarantine and here's why, and then we would analyze them for trends. And one of the things that really stood out to me, even back in 2008, was that people were saying, well, for spiritual practice, for religious worship, they just, it just didn't matter. That's so essential to their identity and their community. They would go. And, so we collected all of these sort of interesting and hard to predict details from players, moms saying, well, if schools are shut down, who's going to take care of the kids during the day? Am I going to not be able to work? All of these things that actually, when a real pandemic started in 2019, rolling into 2020, we started to see similar social consequences, but they hadn't been predicted by the experts in public health or epidemiology. And, I remember very early in 2020, early February, trying to share out some of the results from our simulations and things like, we don't think people will necessarily follow masking advice. And, here's under what circumstances they would not do social distancing. But it sounded implausible because a lot of what players reported or predicted for themselves was irrational, like driven by all kinds of, just emotions and needs and values, and not necessarily what would be the most practical or rational thing to do. But then it turned out that people did successfully predict what they themselves and others would do. And it made me want to, I guess, capture, like, what is it about people imagining their own futures that actually works as like a forecasting medium, and also to follow up with people who participated and find out, did you experience the pandemic differently as a result of having imagined it so vividly? And these people, I just, one practical point, people are like, what, you like come play a game for a couple hours? These simulations last 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks. You're really living in these worlds in your imagination. And so that, I wanted to follow up with the people, see if it was a different experience. And then also just kind of capture, why do these simulations so accurately predict things that are otherwise hard to predict?
I have so many questions, but I think for the sake of clarity, it is probably useful. Like if we say simulation, that probably means different things to different people. Is it right? Like, so a lot of it, like a typical, not even this simulation specifically, but a typical simulation might be people in different places, like logging on for an hour a week or doing an exercise for 10 minutes a day. It's not continuously pretending to live.
Yeah.
And you're right. Or it's not like wacky costumes necessarily.
No. There's no costumes.
They're awesome.
You're giving me ideas, Curtis, for future games. No, so practically speaking, these games, I always like to say, these are not like 3D virtual worlds. You're not walking around with an avatar. The games are played on essentially fictional social networks. So we'll build a social network. It'll look and work like Facebook or Twitter or Discord, whatever sort of feels like the best kind of social environment. And then everybody is posting like little personal updates, or they're asking for help or news headlines and photos, or videos of what they're thinking, but they're all from the future scenario. And so it is, I think actually the type of activity that's most similar to is like fan fiction. Everybody's like writing their own versions of this future. and you're not playing a fictional character, you're playing yourself, right? So I would say, you know, if I were asking you, Curtis, to participate in a pandemic simulation, I'd say, okay, your new book's coming out, but it's a pandemic. Like, how do you imagine having to adapt, you know, your book tour and your writing routines? So people are bringing their own personal expertise, their lived experience. They can more accurately project forward, and it's a sort of constellation of stories that people write. It becomes this world. So you can come onto these social networks, and literally it's just like, you know, you spend an hour in your Facebook stream reading what your friends and neighbors are up to. But everybody's up to the future in these games. And some people do spend more than 10 minutes. I mean, some people get really into it, and they might spend, you know, many hours a week really deep diving into it and collaborating with others. You know, let me find the other moms, let me find the other teachers, the other nurse practitioners, and they imagine the future together, which is really my favorite part, when these sort of smaller communities start to build on each other's ideas and collaborate.
One thing that you talk about in the book is, you know, predicting or sort of anticipating the possibility of a pandemic, and then also simultaneously, you know, like climate crises in California or elsewhere, and wildfires, and then also political, you know, division, and again, this is 10 or 12 years ago. And one of the things that I think is like fascinating and about the book, and, you know, you're very sort of humble about this, is that in some ways, to read a description of the book, you could think almost like you sit with a crystal ball and you're like, whatever, like you know, like gaze up at the sky and see the shape of the clouds. And you're very clear about, you know, like scientists and public health experts and, you know, foreign policy experts anticipate all this stuff. Like, it's not a secret. And so I wonder, one, can you talk about the specific sources where you get your information to kind of anticipate what's coming? And then also, you kind of classify trends, or not trends, I feel like isn't the right word, but you kind of classify signals from the future in different ways. And I'm wondering if you could talk about what those classifications are.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm glad you brought up the sort of, you know, crystal ball versus, well, everybody saw it coming. I mean, I really wanted to demystify the process that people like myself use when we're trying to create future scenarios that are actually, you know, plausible and possibly useful to imagine. And I would say, you know, my main habit is just to try to find experts who've dedicated their lives to preparing for future risks or threats. I do specialize in imagining, you know, maybe challenging futures. I just am kind of drawn to that. And if you're willing to acknowledge the reality of possible coming disruptions, it's really easy to predict the future. The problem is, you know, many of us, we don't want to think about these things because they're difficult to think about, they're painful to think about, or maybe they feel outside of our control. So what's the point in thinking about them? So, you know, the reason the book is called Imaginable is because all of these events that we've been living through over the past couple of years that we describe so often as unimaginable or unthinkable, they were imagined, they were thought about. And I kind of want to galvanize us to be willing to imagine things that we used to say were unimaginable. And it's not just the bad stuff. It's positive change, transformative social change we might want to create, you know, future of learning, future of work, future of, you know, economic equality. I mean, we can use the same skills that I use to simulate, you know, futures that we might not want to wake up in, to simulate futures we want to wake up in. And one of the essential tools for that is to track and analyze what professional futurists call signals of change, as you said. I think the easiest way to describe signals of change is it's just like every art form has its own raw material. So in the way that writers work with words and fashion designers work with fabric and chefs work with food ingredients, futurists work with these signals of change, which are just real things that are already happening out in the world that give us a clue as to how the future might be different, or what we could expect to wake up to someday if that signal became, more significant. And so it's this act of scaling up possibilities and projecting out, trends. But I can give you an example of my practice. Every single day I try to collect a new signal of change. And I just saw something that one of the new technologies that I research is facial recognition, and trying to figure out, are we really going to incorporate this technology into our everyday lives? Because it seems like there's a lot of concerns around privacy and how it might be used for surveillance or by the governments. And it seems like nobody wants this technology. So people are often very dismissive of it. Well, it's not going to be like a Black Mirror dystopian future, because who wants to live in a world? Nobody wants that. But I just saw today a story about how the biggest sort of bad guy facial technology company, Clearview AI, which normally when you read news stories about them, it's very negative. It's like unbelievable amounts of intelligence they've collected to identify billions of people. Nobody gave their permission. It's like how they're trying to sell it to governments and police. You always hear these bad stories. They just volunteered, basically donated their database and technology for use in Ukraine to help people in Ukraine identify members of the military or Russians, operatives. And there was this glowing news story in the Washington Post about this. And to me, that's an interesting signal of change potentially, because it was the first time I've really seen anyone say anything positive about facial recognition. And, it's just one small thing that's happening. But when you see something that makes you say, wow, I've never seen that before, I've never heard people talk like that before, that's like, to futurists, we are like, okay, going to pay attention to this, because we're always looking for the things that like catch us off guard, or that we might otherwise dismiss as it gets too weird, it's like ridiculous. And then we just kind of plant these in our imagination and start to look, are there more clues that suggest, if I see another positive facial recognition story, I'm going to know for sure we need some scenarios that really incorporate this technology, and really look at the, what is motivating people, what are the, perceived benefits, so we can do a better job of like preparing our communities, and our organizations and our families for what it might be like to live in a world where, literally every app on our phone has facial recognition baked in.
So, this kind of dovetails nicely into one of the things that I think is really kind of deft and skillful about the book is you're pretty candid about the fact that a lot of future scenarios are, to our ears and eyes now, like alarming or disturbing or anxiety inducing. And yet I definitely feel that this is an optimistic book, and like an optimistic book grounded in realism. And I guess this would be another two-part question. Like, how do you do that? Like, one, how do you kind of maybe the better way to ask it is like, what are the reasons that you feel optimistic, even though, you are very realistic about climate change, or about technology being a double-edged sword at best, or, like how do you retain your optimism, and how do you kind of encourage other people to do that too?
That's good. That is a two-part question, because there's kind of it's kind of like two completely different things. Like, one of the things that I specialize in, that I love, it's like the most joyful activity that I can do as like a futurist, is figure out how to take people through a very difficult to think about future scenario that would normally make us anxious or depressed or feel hopeless, and have them come out on the other side of this imagination experience or this simulation really feeling empowered and hopeful. Like, I think it's like this magic trick that I can just transform these features. And there's a very simple technique usually that gets people from being like, oh, I don't even want to think about that, to, oh man, I'm ready for this future. I feel confident, I feel clarity. And the trick is just that in imagining these future scenarios, the sort of most important question that I ask people to answer, and maybe they would take hours or days or even weeks to come up with their specific answer to this question, is how would you help others in this future? So thinking about, and we go through this whole process of, what do you know a lot about that most people don't know a lot about? Or what are you good at? Like just skills that you have. What are your values, your passions? What communities do you belong to? And so if you're imagining yourself in a future scenario, you might think about what you do as a mom, a loving mom, what you do as somebody who can, for me, one of my skills is, I think, communicating science to like non-scientists, explaining it. So is there any science that needs communicated in this future? And you're just trying to take whatever we bring to any future scenario, it's those core personal strengths and skills and experiences, and applying them. And it's a creative activity. I say, like, you make your list before you know what the scenario is. So there's like almost like a playfulness to it. Oh, you're obsessed with Bollywood movies. Okay. And this is, it's funny, at Stanford, we do these 2-day workshops, how to think like a futurist. And I was doing these in 2016 and 17 and 18. The last one was in 2019, in the spring of 2019. And I would have them make a list of everything they were good at. And then they would spend half a day saying how they would use that in case of a respiratory pandemic. And they would just come up with like these super creative things. And they would leave being like, yeah, because you're reinforcing your strengths, right? It's like the future is an opportunity to think about how you might be of service to something bigger than yourself, or use your strengths to help others. That just feels good, even if you're thinking about difficult scenarios. The other thing is that thinking about these future crises or disruptions, it can be a way to kind of work through the trauma of the past. So surprisingly, one type of scenario that I've had a lot of people asking me for this year is a scenario about the next pandemic. And when I kind of dig into why do people want to play with another pandemic when we're still in this one, is there's this really strong desire to believe that we would do better next time. That's the question I keep getting. Like, how will we do better during the next pandemic? Let's imagine it. Let's simulate it. Even while we're trying, we have to do better in this one, but the future becomes this like space of hope, and to kind of work through the trauma of the failures of what we've just been through. And to me, this very strangest thing about Imaginable, the book coming out, is the thing I love to ask readers is like, what was your favorite scenario in the book? Because there are some fun ones, some hopeful ones, futures that sound great. And almost everybody has been saying that it's the next pandemic one. It's this tick-borne pandemic that makes you allergic to meat. And I was almost worried about having something like that in here, because I thought, oh, are we really ready to think about the next, but there's something therapeutic about imagining how we might react faster, or adapt faster, or really be able to help others using what we've lived through. There's almost like a kind of, post-traumatic growth that we can experience in imagining these future situations. So that's not how I maintain optimism about the future, but that's how I see that playing with difficult futures actually creates incredible, positive emotions and personal, intuitions that we can apply. And then for me, do you want that was a super long answer. I'll give you my 30-second practical habit. When I'm feeling anxious about a future, like let's say climate action, or climate change. I go to Google, and I go to like Google News, Google Scholar, whatever. And I type like the thing I want to see, like the thing that would make me feel better. Actually, one thing I type in anyway, I was giving a specific example, but I don't want to create any anxiety for our viewers. So I won't say what I'm actually anxious about, but I type in something good. So it's like new solution to extreme heat, or innovation in facial recognition, ethics, or whatever, like whatever would make me feel better. And it turns out there are usually people working on it. There is always a news story. There's always a scientific paper. Somebody's out there also. And so you find the helpers who are trying to make this better. You see examples of positive solutions. And so part of it's just a practice. Like you got to go looking for the good stuff too. And even if you can't imagine it yourself, you're like, I feel like this doesn't even exist. Try typing it into Google and you may be surprised to discover all of these things that can fuel our positive imagination and not just our shadow imagination.
Would you, I guess, I think that there are, my understanding, there's a lot of educators and maybe a lot of parents watching tonight. And do you think, like, especially around the issue of climate change, which I think can feel so overwhelming, and it can also feel sort of like, you know, older generations have failed younger generations. Would you say that, you know, if there are kids or teenagers who are feeling very discouraged about environmental issues, would you recommend that parents or teachers kind of say what you've just said, or maybe like seek out those articles together or those news stories together?
Yeah, I mean, I do think what young people need today are easy to imagine, vivid future scenarios that describe successful climate action, right? Because, you know, they need a little more hope. They need something to base their hope on, that that the climate change is not irreversible, that inaction is not inevitable. It's why at the end of Imaginable, I have these 3 big scenarios for people to play, and I invite them to like spend 10 days imagining yourselves these features. And all 3 of them describe very coordinated, motivated action to try to take really strong creative measures to fix the climate situation in different ways. Just because I want people to at least plant these possible plausible futures that we can do something, you know? And so, you know, even just sort of understanding electrification, right? Like there's one clear path to fix the climate crisis, which is electrify everything, you know, and then just use clean energy. It's all solar and wind. I mean, it's actually pretty easy. Now we have to convince companies that, you know, create the fossil fuels and the government to get out of that business. And we have to give people, you know, support to replace their, you know, gas guzzling cars. Like, I mean, there's going to be a lot of work involved and we have to reinvent and engineer, but there is at least one path out. It's not unknown. It's not unimaginable how we fix it. And then we kind of, you know, work our way backwards. How do we get to a world? What will people need to actually live up to this vision or follow this path? So I think, yeah, what young people need are clear, vivid images that they can, you know, create for themselves by learning to look for signals of change, or by really making specific to their own lives, you know, visions that are out there. So if the vision is to electrify everything, have them like, you know, draw pictures of what the school looks like when everything's electrified, or, you know, like really making it personal so that it's easier to imagine.
A lot of the sort of, maybe all of the scenarios that you talk about, maybe not all, take place 10 years out. And can you talk a little bit about, you know, I think you described the 10-year mark as maybe a magic number, and why that's the case?
Yeah. So this is like the first thing I learned when I started training at the Institute for the Future. They're like famous for their 10-year forecast. And then whenever we would get a project, you know, imagine the future of food or the future of universities, it was always like, okay, so this is going to be set 10 years in the future. And you know, there are a lot of reasons why professional futurists have gravitated towards the 10-year timeline. One is that it's just possible for a lot to change in 10 years. And, you know, a lot of future imagination, it's designed to either prepare us for really big disruptions, or to imagine transformative change, positive change that's so, profound, it would really, really be different. But it's, again, going to take a while to achieve that kind of change. So we set it 10 years out so people can really believe that these scenarios that we create or these forecasts that we share, are possible and worth considering. It turns out when we try to imagine change a year from today or 3 years or 5 years, people are very resistant. Our brains are very resistant. Our brains have kind of two ways of considering what is possible. In the near term, it looks to information about the past or the present, like tucking away into the hippocampus. What are the facts that I've seen that I know are true? And it tries to use those patterns to project forward something similar. But when you ask people to imagine 10 years out, the brain goes into this default mode, which is more of like a conjuring. Instead of being limited to what it has direct knowledge or experience of, the brain feels more playful. It recombines things. It turns things upside down. And so there's even at a, we can all sort of acknowledge intuitively that 10 years is enough time to change. But even the brain, like at neurological level, it gives us permission to really take seriously ideas that we would otherwise dismiss. And then you can look at history and see, social change can often be accomplished in 10 years, a great deal. We say from the first major protest against racial segregation to the successful passage of the Civil Rights Act in the United States, 10 years, 10 years to go from the first country legalizing same-sex marriage to it being supported by a majority of citizens in a majority of countries. This once previously, controversial or unthinkable idea. Technology often unfolds in these same 10-year cycles. 10 years from the first iPhone to a majority of people on the planet having smartphones. So 10 years is enough time for things to change. It's enough time for us to make change. If we want to be an agent of change, 10 years gives us this sort of time spaciousness also to set higher goals, be more ambitious, build a bigger movement. And so for all of these reasons, it's like 10 years is just such a wonderful kind of liberating timeline to play with. And it's also not so far that we feel disconnected from it. Like we can look back 10 years and still remember who we were 10 years ago. But 20, 30, people do tend to have a harder time relating to.
I thought one of the most interesting exercises, which I've described to a lot of people, is like when you say, picture waking up tomorrow, which is pretty effortless, I think, at least for me. And then you say, picture it in a year, and that's like, pretty effortless. And then you say, picture 10 years. And I start to think like, and then when you say, think back in your own life to 10 years ago, like, as you were just saying, I mean, certainly, I don't think I've had an exceptionally dramatic life, but when I think about how different things were in the country, in my life, and where I lived, and so it is a very sort of like quick but powerful exercise, which I think the book is full of. So I want to maybe ask you a few questions about how sort of we arrived at this moment, like what in your own background. I know that you're an identical twin, and then also I believe that you and your sister are the children of teachers, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And I'm just sort of curious, what made you a game designer, and then what sort of made you kind of become a game designer / futurist? Like what in your upbringing, what in your personality, in the circumstances of your adult life?
Yeah. So my mom taught in elementary schools, public elementary schools, for her whole career. My dad taught public high school history. My mom was specialized like first grade, second grade. We definitely lived in a house where we were encouraged to try new technologies, to always, we were like the first people, even though we were like, because my parents were public school teachers, we were not like, we were not the richest kids in the neighborhood, but we were like the first ones on the internet, getting the modem, dialing up to these bulletin board systems like before AOL, before Prodigy. We got a personal computer that I'm sure we could not afford. It was used, a Commodore 64, when I was like 9 years old. And
okay, wait, how old are you?
how old am I? 44.
I hope that's not inappropriate, because I'm 46, by the way. So I was like, that's amazing. Like the internet was not part of my life until I went to college.
Oh yeah. No, we were on the internet in 7th and 8th grade. I mean, the thing that was interesting about I will say, like, my parents, they're not scientists, they're not technologists, but they always saw even games, because we were playing them on computers. They saw it as like a way to build confidence with technology. And I would say, like, the thing I'm most grateful to my parents is they never once said, stop playing games and go do something real, or go play outside. They were totally happy for me to be like tinkering around. And in the old days, you could stop the game, like rewrite the code and change it. So, that there was like a kind of game maker aspect to it. But that is something I try to do, not as like an educator, but as a futurist with my own kids, is I do want to give them confidence with new technologies that might be important in the coming years. So I have twin daughters, they're 7 years old, and they do know how to fly a drone and take videos and take photos of nature and the community. And I mean, although I will say we do actually, our first drone is still at the top of a redwood tree on our property. It's been up there for like 6 months. Even the strongest winds have not blown it out. So new technology is not without its, mishaps. But I want them to like get in this like messy space of like, before, we have these entrenched notions of how do we use this technology? What are the norms? What are the ways it's like deeply entrenched inside? Like, be early users and feel confident as they grow older, not to be intimidated by these forces of change, these drivers of change. I think that's important, just early exposure, so that they feel like somebody who is comfortable talking about it, learning about it, participating in it. I look back at my, being exposed to computers and internet so early, I always felt confident and capable, even if I didn't quite understand a new aspect of the technology. I'm like, I'm like somebody who does this, which it didn't have to be that way. So I'm very grateful to my parents for doing that.
Do you think there are other things they did either as a strategy or just like naturally to make you sort of a curious person, or someone who, sought out all kinds of new information?
It's so interesting. My mom went back for her PhD when I think we were in high school. It's just, we definitely were in that culture of like, always learning, lifelong learning. And when one of the sort of future topics that does excite me is like really thinking about, what kinds of infrastructure could we create for people to continue learning, and where it's not like, people often talk about going back to school, but like, what is the future like where there is no back to school because there is no end to learning. There's this game in Imaginable that I often run at our 10-year forecast, called 100 Ways Anything Could Be Different in the Future. You take a future topic and you just rewrite like 100 facts about it, and then you rewrite them so the opposite is now true. And then you're forced to sort of look for signals of change that could explain these really weird things. And at the last in-person 10-year forecast before the pandemic, we did this with about, say, 500 people on the future of learning. And one of the facts that somebody wrote down was, at the end of high school, you graduate. And so, the flip fact was, like, there's no such thing as high school graduation. And like, one person's response to that might be like, oh my God, high school, it never ends. This is my dystopian future. But also like, what would, what if we had more time spaciousness to do our learning. And so we didn't have to spend, 8 hours a day in a class and jamming in all these subjects and like just to get out, I mean, like imagine if we had the luxurious of knowing that we would always be learning, what might teenagers be able to do with their time and energy that might support their mental health a little bit differently, or their social development, or their physical, development differently. And then what could we, you and I in our 40s, to be embedded in some kind of learning community that gives us, nourishment and feeds our curiosity. I mean, I just think all of this is very fun to imagine the infrastructure and the types of communities and experiences that would support it. I don't know. I just really get excited about, especially because as I imagine, 10 years from now, my kids would be applying to college. If we were sort of forecasting from today, they'll be 17. And I really like to imagine that universities will be very different by then, that whatever I think I know about applying to college today will be totally irrelevant by then because of how much has changed.
And so, okay, so going back to sort of your story, what made you become a game designer, and then what made you kind of switch, at least partly, into being a futurist?
Yeah, I mean, it was very like I said, like a crab sneaking up sideways on becoming a game designer. I mean, like my favorite internship in college was working for Parks and Recreation in New York City, helping organize like the Easter egg hunt on the Great Lawn for 30,000 kids, or game tournaments, like, board. I mean, I was very much interested in like these large scale recreation events and live events. And I also worked in, off-Broadway theater in New York, and the sort of just like what happens when lots of people come together in the same physical space, back then, and have this shared experience. Right. And when I went to grad school to study, theater and collective experience, there was like a Craigslist ad for a new startup company. I went to grad school at Berkeley, and so it's like San Francisco, Silicon Valley, like 2001, height of, interesting startups. And they were like, we're going to make a game that you play in the real world. It's going to be like a video game, but in the real world. And we're going to send quests on like mobile phones. And I was like, oh, I could stage manage it, because I was coming out of off-Broadway stage managing, and it sounded like theater. And also I loved playing games. And I wound up helping create this like new genre of games that hadn't existed, where people are running around the city, and there's like, they're doing missions like, the payphone rings, you answer the phone, it gives you a combination, you have to find a lock, there's a float, you got to blow it up and go out on the lake and like put on your snorkel, like this whole, you're living this real world adventure. And I noticed that people who played the game, they would come back to their games and be like, oh, every time I'm in the Mission District, or every time I'm in Golden Gate Park, I'm like talking to everybody, even though I know it's like not still the game. I feel this desire to interact with people, or I'm like going down alleys I've never been down before, into shops. Like this sense of curiosity had been awakened, the sense of agency. Like I didn't used to spend time in this neighborhood. Now I feel like I belong there. I go there. I have this like confidence and playfulness. And I was so intrigued by that weird, blurring of a game, a limited game they played for a few hours on one day, and then like transforming the relationship for weeks and months after. So then I convinced my graduate advisors to let me study weird new forms of games and their psychological effects. And the more I studied, the more excited I got about like, we can harness this for good. We can bring the power of games to help people feel more curiosity or more excitement or agency, in whether it's, in their healthcare, in learning, at work, and now, in terms of how we face the future.
And then how did the futurist part come in for you, or working at the Institute in Palo Alto?
Yeah. So I was scouted by the Institute. I learned later. So there's this famous saying, you may have heard of this. It's known to non-futurists too. Alan Kay said that the best way to predict the future is to invent it. So the Institute for the Future, where I work, they often just like bring people in who are doing weird things, like who are the living signals of change. And I was running around trying to invent new genres of games and change game culture to solve real world problems. And so they saw me as a signal of change. They said, come like hang out with us, and make some games here. Like, and that by my participating, maybe, they would understand the future of games better. And I just wound up realizing, well, I'm trying to make games where people solve real problems. Maybe the future is, a problem that we could solve or a challenge that we could tackle. But it was, I don't know. I mean, it could have probably gone many other ways. And I'm just kind of, literally just like being in the right place at the right time, Silicon Valley and futurists and game startups. Yes.
Well, I also mentioned to you that one of the things that was sort of, personally fascinating for me about the book is that so many descriptions of imagining the future, literally, like without changing a word, like so many sentences describe the process of writing a novel, which is what I do. And I wanted to, it's funny because I actually started to make a list and there were so many that I was like, I don't have time, but there's a couple, there's one on page 187 that I'll, and so something that I was sort of, I mean, it's interesting because I do wonder if you had this skill set that like you've ended up employing in this very kind of like public, generous spirited way where you could have just eventually found your way to like sitting in a room by yourself. But anyway, one of the things you describe is sort of trying to imagine like you talk about hard empathy. And first, let you define that. How do you define hard empathy?
Oh, I mean, hard empathy is when you're trying to imagine what someone else is going through and you have no direct experience. Like for people in Ukraine who have been displaced by war, I have never lived through anything remotely like that. How do I activate compassion or empathy so that I understand, what am I called to do to help or to witness what suffering, can I witness? It's difficult and we're not always very good at it. Like what we guess, it can be hard to guess accurately if we don't have any of our own experience to draw on, which is what makes it hard.
and so I feel like the advice that you give is sort of like, imagine these circumstances that this other person is experiencing, but instead of imagining like I'm a Ukrainian person, think like I am myself, I am my age, which is also something that you encourage in the future scenarios where you're saying you're not a different person 10 years from now. Like there might be circumstances that are different, but you're you. But and again, I'm not sure if this is of wide interest, so I won't go. But like when you say things like the hard empathy technique helps you blend objective facts about someone else's reality with your own subjective feelings and reactions. Instead of just guessing what someone else might feel, you're really feeling something yourself, or it's grounded in the middle space between your real feelings and the other person's real life. Like that is fiction. I mean, it's like, and literally, I won't go on, but I really could for like 20 minutes if all the other, I mean, do you, and this is, you feel free, like you out of politeness, you don't have to like humor me on this, but do you think that, reading fiction creates any kind of like, I don't know if it's like a skill set or flexibility in the brain that helps to imagine the future, and again, feel free to say no.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. It's the thing that's really important to imagine the future. One of the things is like scene construction, being able to imagine a specific moment in time. It's not just what is the world like in 10 years. It's like I'm having breakfast, or I'm on a date, or it's a birthday. But like, how are these things different? How are parties different? How is the book that I'm reading? And you have to be able to set a scene, and there have to be real people in it, and it has to have, a time of day. And I do think in the same way a novelist tell stories, the more that you when you read fiction, you're learning about that construction of moments that in chains sort of unfold the narrative. And I think that is the essential skill that, I think a lot of people think when you talk about the future, it's a bunch of predictions, in the future, California has seceded from the United States. Like, it's a fact, it's abstract, but effective future imagination is, on the day of the Cal exit election, I, Jane McGonigal, voted to remain, and here's why. And I'm setting the scene of when I'm like pulling or whatever the lever, and how hard it was. How would you tell this story in the same way that you would tell it in a novel? And it's interesting. The very first future forecasting game that I co-created just this month won, they call it a Legacy Peabody Award. So it's literally 15 years later, they were like, you know what, this is more significant than we realized at the time. But the Peabody Award category was for collective creation. And essentially everybody who played the game and contributed a story, a scene. This was about an oil crisis. It was called World Without Oil. Everybody shares the Peabody Award, not just the futurists and the scenario developers, but every player. There were about 1,200 players, and they told thousands of stories from an oil crisis. But they were personal details, a college student going to school, or, a soldier. What is it like to be serving in a time of an oil crisis? So I do think that it means the future is fiction, right? There are no facts about the future. We have to decide what we want to imagine.
Yeah, I felt like, what you're saying about that, the primary point of thinking like a futurist is not to make predictions that will come true, right? I mean, would you say, is it accurate to say it's more to practice or to kind of feel more optimistic about, like, do you think it can be boiled down to this is the number one, or these are the 2 or 3 most important reasons to think like a futurist?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to unstick our minds. That's why, like, the first part of the book, if you weren't going to read the whole thing, you read the first part.
Read the whole thing.
Because it's just so that we are more, it's almost like, a Buddhist practice. I think about it. Like, can you acknowledge the reality of change? Can you accept change? Can you create change? And in order for us to change our lives, our community, society, whatever we want to have agency in transforming or shaping, we have to be flexible. We have to believe that literally anything could change, even things that seem impossible to change today. We have to be exposing ourselves to forces of change, drivers of change, signals of change. And, for me, like, maybe people want to learn these skills. They're never going to imagine society changing. They're just trying to unstick their life, but like literally rewrite the facts of your life and then rewrite them so that the opposite is true. All of this applies to our own lives and families as much as it does to society. And so I just think that mental flexibility, that willingness to be a part of change, not get stuck in old ways of doing things, or refusing to accept, when things are changing, acknowledge, that's the main benefit. And I just feel like it's liberating, it's energizing, it's a creative practice, just to imagine how things could be different in our own lives or in the world or in fiction.
I agree.
That's bright. I'm going to turn that down. Curtis, what a great interview with Jane. It was so great to get some of that back history and think about Jane as a child and a student and her family. And you're correct that we have a lot of parents and educators on the Zoom. So it's nice for them to kind of get a sense of, it's not really like, how do you build your own Jane? It's not so much like that, of course, but it was quite insightful. I appreciate that. Thank you so much for such a great interview and your great preparation. We really appreciate it. Excuse me. I want to remind folks that Jane is going to be joining us for after hours. It's going to start at 8:05 Central. We're going to give her a 5-minute break in between this and the after hours. She's had a bit of a long day, so she might trim after hours a little bit short. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of a heads up on that. But please do join us. We'll put the link in chat right now. Come hang out. There's been a flurry of last minute good questions here, so I'm going to jump right in. Maybe a quick answer on this, Jane, if you can. Someone is asking that they just finished the book. They loved it. They're a school administrator in technology and innovation. They want to know what's an opportunity to take a class on creating or writing future simulations. So he wants to learn more so he can bring it to his professional practice. Do you have suggestions on your website? Do you direct people to your website, or what do you suggest?
So there are 5 classes on Coursera, which are free to audit. You can earn a certificate. There's one class in particular called Collaborative Foresight that focuses on scenarios and simulations. You can also join Urgent Optimists, which is the Institute for the Future's first public membership program or community. And we are playing through all the scenarios in the book. We have Scenario Club. People are sharing their own scenarios that they're creating. It's a vibrant community of practice. So that is a good place to come and be inspired.
Thank you. And Anne-Marie just posted the Urgent Optimist website URL in there. We'll send it out with the recording so you'll grab it there as well. Quick question. Someone's asking, Lisa saying, do government entities take your findings from futurist games seriously? And I don't think they mean that in a rude way. What they mean is like, so how are you collaborating perhaps with any kind of governments? And she says, in other words, is your research put to good use? Or would you like it to be used more to help in situations like our pandemic?
I mean, I would say it is more likely to be put to good use going forward because now there's a little bit more of a track record of them actually being helpful in the data that they produce. It depends on who's commissioned the game. I mean, I've done games commissioned, by the Rockefeller Foundation to imagine future economies, by the World Bank to imagine future of learning, then NSA to figure out what weird things people might do with new space technology, satellites and things. So if it's commissioned, then it gets used. But I mean, a lot of the work that I do now is, it's of public benefit, and I focus on making individuals ready for the future, and provoking what I public foresight rather than delivering a report to an entity at the end of the day. That I see the results, like the results of my simulations are the people who played are thinking differently or feeling differently and acting differently.
And then another 7:58. Okay, time for another quick question from Linda. She says, how representative are the game players? In other words, do you try to balance demographics in some way when you're doing these large game simulations?
Yeah, I mean, we go into different communities. When I do a project with the World Bank, we will definitely work with community organizers to try to engage specific communities. They actually did a randomized control trial of one of these future forecasting games where they did control for previous educational experience, socioeconomic backgrounds, gender, ethnicity. And so when you can, yes, we do that. One of the most successful projects that I did was with the organization Facing History and Ourselves, where we had 10,000 high school students from a very diverse range of schools and communities, and they were imagining a future neurosensing social network, a network where we might be able to share our thoughts and feelings unfiltered instead of writing about them or taking photos, just straight from our brain. And so, in that case, yes, we did work very, we were very conscious of wanting to have a representative game base. And then sometimes we just start them and whoever comes. And that's, that can be fun and interesting too, to just see who shows up.
Okay, well, we're closing out. Jane, do you want to sign us off? Maybe some words for Curtis and for the audience here before we log off?
Oh, well, I mean, many thanks to Fan and to Curtis for bringing us together tonight. And I'm grateful to everyone who came to think a little bit about the future, because it's so easy to just really be focused on the present. And when we give ourselves permission to think about the future, sometimes that is a rare gift. And so I thank everybody for giving themselves that gift and each other.
Great. Thank you. Curtis, thank you again. It's a pleasure to get to know you, and keep this in mind for the next book. We can't wait.